My companion and I were heading to a new restaurant on Church Street that was getting good reviews. To get there, we had to walk past one of Nashville's few gay clubs, and as we walked through, the front door suddenly burst open and two guys walked out. Through the open door, we saw a female impersonator on stage dressed as Madonna. My companion looked at me. "I don't understand. Why are they doing this?" Instantly, my thoughts went back to Mickey and Beth. 24 months ago, Brooklyn. "I hate the bar scene," I exclaimed. Another attempt to find female company ended in failure. Mickey was just laughing, but I was serious. I had been in a bar in Soho for less than an hour when some drunk girl suddenly turned around and spilled 2 beers all over my shirt and pants. She apologized vaguely, and the bartender lent me a clean towel, but it was no use. All I had to do was finish the evening early and return to my apartment. It was humiliating to travel on the subway in such a state. Nobody wanted to sit next to me. They must have thought I was some tramp who peed himself. I myself could hardly stand the smell. When I finally got to my stop, I noticed a lot of sideways glances at the station. People who ride the subway don't usually look at you directly, but I still noticed the attention I was getting. I just hoped that no one I knew would be around. It's rare to meet someone you know in New York, but I thought I'd be lucky today. When I finally got to my apartment, I had trouble getting my keys out of my wet pockets. Mickey must have heard me because the door suddenly opened, and he stood there, filling the opening. "Well, we had a party," he exclaimed with a grin. I didn't really like his sense of humor, but it's better not to be an insolent 6-footer to a guy, even if he's a drag queen. I moved to the Big Apple 18 months ago, right after graduating from engineering school. I received a master's degree in computer science with a concentration in security systems. Thanks to some unknown but benevolent deity, I landed my dream job at Google right after graduation. Not only did they offer me an amazing starting salary, but they also offered me a move to New York City from Nashville, my hometown. My classmates were very jealous, and I also felt pretty good about my achievement, at least until the moment I started looking for housing. I thought I could rent a nice apartment in Manhattan with my new salary. When I started checking the ads, it turned out that I was right if I was willing to share a place with 5 other people. I actually looked at a few offers that I could afford. The best of them offered a bedroom the size of a small closet. The worst, I won't even try to describe it, but the description can be found in Dante's Divine Comedy in the section Hell. Suffice to say, after a few scouting trips, I just wanted to hide in my hotel room. This guy was in culture shock. "You're doing it all wrong," my colleagues at Google advised me. "Forget about owning your own place, you can't afford it. And forget about living in Manhattan unless you're willing to live in a high-crime area. You need to look in other areas. Try Brooklyn, that's where all the young professionals live. You'll still have to have neighbors, but at least not so many that you can't remember their names. Start with Craigslist." And that's how I found myself on a street in Brooklyn, a mile from the nearest subway station, looking for the address I needed. The street was lined with charming old brownstone houses, each with a front porch, all shaded by mature plane trees. But I was warned that I would not find anything there. The yuppies bought all these houses and actively renovated them, and then sold them at premium prices. For what it would take to buy one of those renovated brownstones, I could buy a mansion in Nashville. I turned the corner onto a commercial street and almost missed the address. Right next to the restaurant in the area, there was an inconspicuous doorway facing the street. The number above it has faded over time. I had to go back to find it. Once I found it, I walked down the long hallway that led to the stairs. The apartment I was looking for was on the 2nd floor. The description sounded good, and the rent was high but affordable. When I responded to the listing email, I was given an appointment to view the apartment and meet the residents, Mickey and Beth. I thought, no pair. Whether they were, the advert said 3 bedrooms. When I knocked on the door, I saw an eye looking at me through the door peephole before the door opened to reveal a slender, attractive young woman wearing a skirt over a gymnastics leotard. I thought, this might be good. "Are you Peter Morrison?" she asked sharply. "Yes, I'm Peter," I replied, "and you must be Beth. I came to inquire about an apartment that's for rent." She frowned slightly when I spoke, and I wondered if my southern accent had put her off, but she simply motioned for me to come in. I tried to ask her a question, but she waved me off. "You need to talk to Mickey." We emerged from a short hallway into a decent-sized living room. There was a man sitting on the couch who I assumed was Mickey. When Beth and I walked in, he stood up and kept getting up. He must have been 6'5", even in a high-ceilinged room. He was a dominant figure. I was worried. If he was grumpy or had difficulty getting along, he would make a scary flatmate. But I relaxed when he politely began showing me around the apartment, pointing out its various advantages. And it was really good, better than anything I've seen so far. I think the inconspicuous entrance scared off developers and kept rents low. Anyway, I liked this place. I was even more pleased when I saw the sleeping arrangements. The apartment originally had 2 bedrooms, but the larger one was divided into 2 smaller rooms. To my surprise, Mickey and Beth offered me the large bedroom. The reason for their generosity became clear when they explained how much of the rent would be mine, 60% of the total. However, I could afford it, and it looked like a real opportunity, the first one I had seen. When we returned to the living room, I learned that my decision was not necessarily important. Both of them started asking me about my work, my background, my interests, and my lifestyle. I patiently answered their questions, but in reality, it was like being interviewed for admission to some exclusive club. 20 minutes later, Mickey suddenly stood up and began pacing. Even though he was on the other side of the room, he still seemed to tower over me. "You seem like a normal guy," he said. "I have just one question. Do you like men?" "What?" I muttered. "No, of course not." I didn't understand what could have given him such an impression. "Oh," he said, "it's a shame. Beth and I, yes." I looked at them in surprise. This man who looked like he could play football and the graceful young woman who looked like a dancer were gay. Then I noticed that they were both looking at me, clearly waiting for my reaction. I realized that if I wanted to live in this apartment, my next words would be decisive. "I love women," I repeated, "but I hope you won't hold it against me." They looked at each other. Then Mickey laughed out loud and Beth gave me a smile. "Okay," he said, "I think you might be our only straight guy." After that, we all relaxed, and they accepted me into their little family. It turns out I was right about Beth. She was a dancer. Of course, this was not her main source of income. Her regular job was as a waitress in a prestigious restaurant in Brooklyn. During the day, she spent long hours in the dance studio or went to auditions for Broadway musicals. She received several roles in the corps de ballet, but they were not lucrative enough to pay rent. But the biggest surprise was that Mickey was also a dancer. I went to see him a couple of times, and there was something both funny and attractive about this giant man in makeup, a dress and heels. He had a regular weekend gig at a club in Greenwich Village. During the day, he worked as a barista at Starbucks. I soon realized that despite the interrogation I had gone through when viewing the apartment, they were desperate for a roommate, especially one who could pay more than half the rent. So we began to live comfortably with each other. I soon got used to seeing Mickey in lipstick and eyeshadow, and if Beth occasionally had a female guest who stayed overnight, I politely ignored her in the mornings while I made myself breakfast. For me, I think I became something like a pet and a zoo animal for Beth and Mickey. I'm exaggerating, of course, but they were truly fascinated by me for several reasons. First of all, I was straight. On top of that, I was a native Southerner, a creature they had only seen on TV, but had never met in real life. My Southern accent was a constant source of amusement for them. Overall, it was educational for the three of us. Working at Google was also educational. The place was filled with very smart people, full of energy and ideas. I thought I was pretty smart when I graduated from engineering school, but I quickly realized that at Google I was just one of many. For the first few months, I felt like an imposter. I didn't know the people, didn't know the procedures, and felt like I was running behind the herd, trying to catch up with everyone else. But gradually, I began to contribute to the team I was assigned to, and after 6 months, I thought I might make it. One of the requirements of my new job was to periodically travel to the company headquarters in California. It was initially exciting to visit Google's Mountain View headquarters, but after a few trips, the novelty quickly wore off. A direct flight from JFK to San Jose takes about 6.5 hours. With tailwinds, the return flight usually takes about 5 hours, but the time difference means you lose 3 hours, so by the time the plane lands over Jamaica Bay, it's usually very late. They still expect you in the office by 9 the next morning. As a result, my personal life suffered, or at least she would suffer if I had a personal life. The stereotype of an engineer is that of a bumbling nerd who is a bit prone to compulsive actions. I hoped that I was the exception that proves the rule. I can't say I was voted most social on campus, but I was pretty active in social activities during my undergraduate years, or at least as active as I could be to still get excellent grades. I didn't find my soul mate, but I was actively looking for one. This all stopped in May of my senior year. My parents were driving down the highway to my graduation ceremony when a drunk driver lost control of his car, crossed the median, and crashed into them head-on. They died instantly. At 21, I was suddenly left alone in this world. I had already been accepted into graduate school in engineering, but there was no chance that I would be able to enroll in the fall. Instead, I spent the next 9 months in a daze dealing with funeral arrangements, attending court for a drunk driver who miraculously survived, getting my parents in order, and grieving. Apart from occasional dinner invitations from sympathetic friends of my parents, social life fell off my schedule. Mitt was understanding. They kept my place until the next year when I finally got my act together. By then, I had sold the family home and closed the chapter of life in Nashville. I will miss my friends and familiar places, but I was glad to put some distance between me and the sad memories of my hometown. I went to Cambridge. Admit, I buried myself in my studies, only occasionally popping out to drink beer with my classmates. And because the ratio of male to female engineers was woefully unbalanced, I had few dating opportunities. By the time I graduated, I was more than ready to resume my social life, and hoped that moving to New York would help me do that. They said the city was full of attractive young women, and I thought my prospects were good. I was wrong. That doesn't mean there weren't plenty of women available, they just weren't what I was looking for. Firstly, many of them were older than me, often 10 to 20 years. In principle, I had no problems with older women, but the main characteristic of those I met was an aura of urgency. They were looking for a potential husband and did not want to waste time. I was often invited into their bed, which was great, but after sex, the conversations usually turned to my plans for the future, my thoughts about children, and other awkward questions that I was not ready to answer. Of course, in addition to those who were too eager to get married, there were many women my age. Unfortunately, most of them I met seemed to be already on the path to alcoholism. The women I encountered in bars were often half drunk by the time I started talking. The people I asked out seemed to need a couple of strong drinks to unwind. Parties simply seemed like an opportunity for them to get drunk. My encounter with a drunk woman in Soho who threw beer on me was the last straw. Complaining about your love life may seem like a waste of time, but Mickey and I became friends, so when I got home early that evening and changed, he patiently listened to my complaints. When I finally fell silent, he shook his head. "You're doing it all wrong, man," he said. "If you keep trying to meet women in bars, the only thing you'll have in common is alcohol." Grabbing my hand, he led me into his bedroom to a small table where his computer sat. "Here's what you should try," he said, typing the URL into his browser. A website called Contact appeared. "Online dating service?" I asked skeptically. "You must be joking." "No, dude, you have it all wrong," Mickey assured me. "Of course, a lot of services are pretty shady, but this one is different. I know some of the guys who work there." I looked at him in disbelief. "Hey," he countered, "we're not all interior decorators. We also have computer scientists." In the end, I let Mickey talk me into trying it. Damn, I thought, this can't be worse than what I've been going through lately. Mickey was right. This service was different. The first difference I noticed was the cost. The initial fee for an annual membership was much higher than I expected. What a fraud, I said indignantly to my huge friend. You do not understand? He asked. This is an elite site. Their fees are deliberately high to weed out fleeting users. Yes, but that's a lot to pay for a service I've never even heard of, I replied. Exactly, he said with a smug smile. They don't target the mass market. They target a more exclusive clientele. Maybe I was tired, or maybe his arguments actually made sense. Anyway, I entered my credit card information and pressed enter, hoping I wasn't throwing money away. The next screen was a questionnaire to fill out. But while other services ask about your ideal woman, as if we all really know until we see it, Contact asked questions about me, my background, my work, my interests. I've taken psychological tests before, and these questions seemed similar. As I was filling out what seemed like an endless questionnaire, Beth walked up to me and began looking over her shoulder at my answers. This is about what I expected, she muttered quietly. I wondered which answer she didn't like, but since Beth seemed unhappy with men in general, it was hard to tell. Anyway, when I got to the bottom of the page and pressed enter, I suddenly realized I was done. The next requirement was a photograph. I didn't have any photos handy, but Beth went to her room and came back with a digital camera. She straightened my hair a little, adjusted a few lampshades to improve the lighting, and took a few pictures. As she reviewed her efforts, I tried to look over her shoulder, but she shooed me away. Well, I demanded, what do I look like? Almost like a person, she quipped. However, she downloaded one of the pictures onto my computer, and when I looked at it, I thought it wasn't that bad. I then uploaded it to be included in my profile. A window appears with instructions to save your profile. When I looked at Mickey with a question, he said, that way, in the future, you can review your answers and make changes if you want. It made sense, so I saved a copy on my hard drive. Now what? I asked. Just wait, Mickey advised. Now the fun begins. After a minute or two, the profiles of 3 women appeared on the screen. Each had a close-up photo and a short description below. My eyes widened. All 3 were very attractive, and a quick check of their profiles showed that they might be interesting to meet. The bottom half of the screen prompted me to rate each profile based on several criteria, including physical appearance, general interests, and overall attractiveness. I clicked on the first one. It was fun. While I was doing my assessments, I heard Mickey and Beth whispering behind my back. I also heard a few chuckles. When I completed all 3, the screen asked me to rank the women by dateability. Tell us who you'd most like to date. Damn, I thought. All 3 of them look a lot better than most of the women I've met lately. But I conscientiously reviewed each one to make sure of my preferences. When I finally ranked them in order 1, 2, 3, I heard Beth speak behind me. I told you so. Pay up, boy. Mickey reluctantly pulled out of his pocket $5 the bill and handed it to her. How do you do it? He asked her. Beth simply smiled discreetly. While this little scene was happening, I was looking at the screen to see what would happen next. Nothing happened. I turned to Mickey. So what's the matter? How do I contact her? When will I get her number? I asked. You won't, he said with a smile. They're just models. They're not real. Before I could get angry, Mickey pointed to the monitor. The new screen had a message for me. Thank you for going through the initial selection stage. Within 24 hours or less, Contact will provide you with profiles of 3 members that best match your tastes and interests based on the information you provide. This time, however, you will receive contact information for all 3. Please feel free to contact any, all, or none of them as you please. Contact will continue to update and refine your profile based on your selections to find the perfect partner for you. Thank you for choosing Contact. That's all? I asked, turning to Mickey. No listings, no photo galleries. Am I just waiting to see who they pick for me? That's right, man, he said, crossing his arms. That's all. But wait. By this time tomorrow, you'll be amazed. By this time tomorrow, I thought, I'll be kicking myself for letting Mickey talk me into this scam. But he was already back in the living room to watch TV, so I turned to Beth. She just smiled at me like a child. "Be patient, Petya," she said. "Be patient." The next morning, I went to work as usual, but I couldn't stop thinking about Contact. Part of me kept wondering if this was just some elaborate scam to scam me out of money, but another part of me couldn't wait to see who the system would pick for me. I desperately wanted to log into Contact at the office to see who was waiting for me, but Google closely monitors all network connections made from its virtual private network and discourages personal use. I was well aware of the company's security capabilities, so of course I wasn't going to take any chances. I just had to wait until I got home. Both Beth and Mickey were home when I returned to the apartment, and they must have known what I was thinking because they both followed me to my desk when I turned on the computer and went to Contact. I should have been annoyed by their curiosity, but since they already knew everything I did, I thought another invasion of my privacy wouldn't matter. The welcome screen said, "Good evening, Peter. Welcome to Contact." Very cool, I thought, that the greeting changed depending on the system clock. "We have 3 suggestions for you." The first suggestion was a redhead with a very pretty face. Her profile said she was a copywriter for an advertising agency on Madison Avenue. Very nice, I thought. She looks like she might be interesting to meet. I clicked on the second offer and saw a tall brunette photographed in front of an oil painting. Sure enough, her profile indicated that she worked at a trendy art gallery in the village. I started imagining Sundays after lunches in museums with her and long discussions over dinner in cozy small restaurants. Definitely attractive. Damn, I thought, this is really cool. Both of these proposals look very promising. Then I pressed number 3 and oh my God, look at her. There was only her face in the photo, but what a face. She had raven hair that fell over her shoulders, framing her dark eyes and high, prominent cheekbones. Of course, she must be a model, I thought. I quickly scanned her profile and learned that she is actually an investment banker. Her interests and preferences seemed to be similar to mine. She, I learned, was a year older than me, but that didn't pose a problem, especially when I looked at her photo again. Beth leaned over my shoulder and I heard her sigh. "Damn," she muttered, "I'd do that too." I grabbed the mouse and moved the cursor to the button with her contact information, but Mickey reached out and stopped me. "Hey, slow down, cowboy. Are you sure you want to pick her for the first time? No offense, man, but I think she might be out of your league." For the first time since I met him, I lost my temper with Mickey. "Leave me alone, dude. You yourself persuaded me to subscribe to this service. If Contact thinks that we are suitable for each other, I will go for it." He raised his hands in a sign of reconciliation. "Sure, Peter, no problem. I just don't want you to get burned." I clicked on contact information and saw her name, Susan Devereaux, along with what appeared to be a cell phone number and her email address. I was about to press the last one, but this time Beth intervened. "Wait a minute, Peter. Are you going to email her?" "Well," I said a little hesitantly, "I thought it would be a subtle way to introduce myself." Beth snorted. "How impressed will she be? An email from some guy she's never heard of. You could say something like, 'Hi, my name is Peter, and I'm a nerd.'" "Okay," I said irritably, "what would you do?" "First of all," she said, "I would call her. At least that way she will be sure that this is a real person." "And if she agrees to meet, what do you plan to ask her to do?" Beth continued. "Well," I stammered, "I was thinking about inviting her to dinner on Saturday." "No, no, no," Beth scolded. "First of all, this girl almost certainly already has plans for Saturday night. You don't want to get rejected the first time you call her. And if she doesn't have plans, you don't want to force her to admit it. That's not cool either." "Okay, then what should I do?" I asked desperately. "Call her and ask if she'll be in town next Monday. If she's traveling for work, it'll likely be midweek, so she's more likely to be free on Monday. And if she's not traveling at least, she'll be impressed that you were thoughtful enough to ask." This actually makes sense, I thought. Second, Beth continued, suggest that we meet somewhere near her office for an after-work drink to get to know each other. But I'm trying to get away from the bar scene, I countered. Just shut up and listen, she said, but smiled so I wouldn't take it personally. Firstly, allowing her to choose a place will increase her sense of security. She will be on her territory, not on yours. Secondly, if you turn out to be a complete failure, it will be easy for her to leave, either by returning to the office or going home. Dove, it's an easy escape for her. You'll reduce her anxiety level. This actually makes sense, I thought. Third, Beth continued, if you two manage to get along, you'll be in a place she likes, and the drink can turn into dinner if she wants. Damn, I said with admiration. Are you sure you don't like men, Beth? You've thought of everything. I've picked up my share of girls, she said, pretending to polish her nails. Okay, I said, I agree. Now shut up and let me make the call. I grabbed my Droid phone, but before I made the call, I entered Susan's name and number into the phone's address book. Aren't you getting ahead of yourself, dude? Asked Mickey. For good luck, I said. Then I clicked connect. I was pleasantly surprised when she answered. To be honest, I didn't believe it would work. Damn it, I wasn't sure she was real. Her voice was low and husky, but still very feminine. It matched her photo perfectly. I introduced myself and acted out the conversation the way Beth had suggested. To my surprise, it worked. She agreed and offered a place in the city center, not far from her office. I said I'd be there around 7 o'clock, and after some small talk, we ended the call. I stepped out of the chair, turned around, and knelt at Beth's feet. I acknowledge your infinite wisdom, O goddess of the dating world, I said as seriously as possible, trying not to laugh. She wasn't impressed. I would have liked it much better if it had been her instead of you. I was tossing around all weekend about our meeting. I kept thinking about what to wear and what conversation topics to choose. Long story short, I acted like a freshman on my first date. Come on, be a man, I told myself several times. It's not like you haven't done this 100 times before. But I had to admit that I had never met a girl who intrigued me so much. When Monday finally arrived, Mickey was already up when I went out to make myself breakfast. As I headed towards the door, he stopped me. Listen, dude, just relax and be yourself. Everything will be fine. As I walked to the metro station, I laughed to myself. Just be yourself. That's pretty ironic advice from a guy who likes to dress up as a woman. But I knew he was right. Now, if only I could follow his advice. Throughout the day, I imagined a dozen scenarios that could have prevented me from getting to the place Susan suggested, but none of them happened, and my taxi actually got me there right at 7 o'clock. I entered the establishment, which was quiet and elegant, and looked around for her. She was nowhere to be seen. I sat down at the bar and began to brace myself for the pain of a failed date, but as soon as I ordered my drink, I felt a hand grab my arm. Peter, she said, and here she is, looking even better in real life than in the photo. The rest of her body matched her face perfectly. She was tall and slender, with long legs accentuated by her stiletto heels. Thank you, contact, I thought. We introduced ourselves, and she pulled my hand. Come on, let's sit in a booth where we can talk and get to know each other. From that moment on, the conversation began and did not stop. I didn't have time to be nervous because I was too interested in what she was saying and sharing my thoughts. When there was finally a pause in the conversation, I realized that it was already 8:30. I didn't know it was so late, I said. Would you like to order dinner to continue the conversation? Oh, I was hoping you would suggest that, she replied immediately. I mentally thanked Beth. We ordered a light dinner and continued talking as if we had known each other for years. She was interesting, funny, she was everything I was looking for. I wasn't sure what effect I had on her, but at least she didn't run away. I was a little confused when I checked my phone and saw that it was after 11 o'clock. I apologized for keeping her so late on a weekday and offered to call her a taxi. We walked out onto the sidewalk and I hailed her a taxi. When I opened the door so she could sit down, she stopped me. "You are very different from the men I usually date," she told me. "Am I good or bad?" I asked with concern. "Okay," she said with a smile. "Most guys would be trying to get into my pants by now." I decided to take a chance. "Good enough to want to meet again?" I asked. "Definitely," she said. "Call me next week." With these words, she kissed me on the cheek and got into the taxi, her stockinged legs shining in the street lighting. I got home around midnight, but I don't remember how I got there. Perhaps I took a taxi or simply levitated the whole way. What a wonderful night. In an incredible display of self-control, I waited until Monday, rather than Sunday of the following week, to call her. As soon as I heard her hoarse voice on the other end of the line, I was lost again. "Hi," I said. "Are you still interested in meeting this week?" Then I mentally kicked myself. This is no way to sound confident and decisive, I thought. "Sure," she said, "let's do it." It seemed to me that there was less enthusiasm in her voice. However, she didn't say no. "Which day is convenient for you?" I asked. I mentally kicked myself again. "Well done. You just let her know that you don't have anything else going on in your life." "Friday will do," she replied. "Great," I said, a little too enthusiastically. Then I made the ultimate concession to helplessness. "Is there anything special that you like to do?" As soon as those words came out of my mouth, I knew I had ruined everything. What a pity, I thought. We've only been on a date once, and I'm out of ideas. She'll want to cancel this date before we even meet. Indeed, I thought I detected a note of impatience in her voice, although it could only have been my imagination. All she said was, "Surprise me." "I can do this," I said with more confidence than I felt, and after a few more minutes of talking, we ended the call. When I looked up, Mickey was looking at me with a strange look. "You're sweating, Peter," he said worriedly. I shook my head sadly. "I ruined everything, Mickey. I had my big chance, and I think I've already ruined everything. How can I ever surprise such a sophisticated, intelligent woman like her?" With that, I told him the whole sad story, including the need to come up with something creative and amazing. Like a true friend, he sat with me and tried to come up with an idea, but nothing sounded special enough. But at the lowest point of my fears, a small voice spoke inside me. "This is your only chance. Go all in or go home." And I decided at that moment that if I was destined to fail, then I would go all the way. Then it dawned on me, and I turned to my huge friend. "Mickey, you have to help me." He listened to my request, and a big smile appeared on his face. "Okay, Peter, I'll do it. It'll be fun. I can't promise it will work, but I can promise she won't forget you." I decided that was all I could ask for. I called Susan again on Thursday to remind her of our date. "I'll meet you at your office," I said, "and we'll go from there." "Where are we going?" she asked. "It's a surprise," I said. "Remember?" Susan left her office around 6:30 the next evening, and I met her in the lobby. After a quick kiss on the cheek, I escorted her to the sidewalk, then called a taxi. Once we were settled, I leaned forward and said to the taxi driver, "Grand Central." Susan looked at me strangely. I just smiled at her. When we arrived, I escorted her through the main hall and up the stairs to the mezzanine. We found a few chairs overlooking the hall and settled down. After a minute or two, Susan couldn't help herself. "What are we doing, Peter?" I looked at the large clock below us and then smiled at her. "Watching people," I said. "Don't you like watching people?" She stared at me. "Well, yes," she agreed, "but—" "Look at that guy, for example," I interrupted her, pointing to a tall man in a fedora and a long trench coat that almost reached the floor. It was walking in our direction, and when it reached a point almost directly below us, it suddenly stopped. As the crowd of people around him continued to walk by, he took off the backpack he was wearing and placed it on the floor. Opening the top of the bag, he reached inside and began to adjust something. Suddenly, a driving rhythm began to sound in the hall. Then we heard Lady Gaga's voice singing. "My mother told me when I was young, we are all born superstars." She curled my hair and put on lipstick. In the mirror in your boudoir. As the word spoke, the figure suddenly stood up to his full height and threw off his coat and hat to reveal a platinum wig and a silver lame dress worn with high heels. Despite the bright red lipstick and false eyelashes, there was no doubt that this incredibly tall blonde was a man. It was Mickey. He began to dance to the music, somehow keeping a perfect rhythm despite his 4-inch heels. Ooh, there's no other way. Baby, I was born this way. We noticed that many passers-by stopped and looked at Mickey. Suddenly, about 20 of them shed their coats in a coordinated manner, revealing their matching suits. Then they moved towards him and began to dance around him, singing along to the music. The song now moved to the spoken part, and Mickey began to spin in a circle, wagging his finger to rebuke the crowd. Don't be a snag, be a queen. Don't be a snag, be a queen. People all over the hall doubled over with laughter, looking at the giant man in women's clothing, who pointed and said, I risked a glance at Susan. She laughed so hard that tears ran down her cheeks, clapping and singing along the whole time. As the song came to an end, the dancers dispersed and blended back into the crowd, leaving Mickey alone. When the last chorus began, he began to climb the stairs towards us, singing as he approached. I was born this way. I was born this way. I'm on the right track, baby. I was born this way. He came over to us just at the end of the last line and plopped down on my lap and gave me a big kiss on the cheek. There was dead silence. Then the hall erupted in applause and shouts. Mickey stood up and bowed to the crowd as best he could in his tight dress, then turned to us. Susan, I said, meet my friend Mickey. Mickey, this is Susan. Mickey leaned down to kiss her cheek. Well, what do you think? He asked her. It was absolutely amazing, she said. At first, I didn't understand what was happening, and then I couldn't believe it was really happening. I've never seen a flash mob live. What fun! Later, we went to Mickey's club and ate and drank while watching the performances. Susan had never been there before and had fun. She was fascinated by Mickey and thought his friends were cute. She laughed and smiled all the time. When we were ready to leave, she pulled me into a taxi with her and gave the driver an address on the Upper West Side. While he was driving, she grabbed me by the lapels of my jacket and turned me towards her. Today was a wonderful surprise. I really enjoyed it. Then she pulled my face to hers and kissed me. When the driver stopped at the curb, I passed him a few bills through the security screen, and then Susan pulled me into her building. The night guard at the desk greeted her, and she waved at him friendlily before pulling me into the elevator. When they reached her floor, she almost ran to her door, fiddling with the key to open it and pulling me inside. There may have been other people in the apartment, but I didn't get a chance to see or greet them as she pulled me into her bedroom and closed the door behind us. Sex with Susan was amazing. We fell asleep together. She didn't have the muscles of an athlete, but her body was toned, and she didn't have an ounce of excess fat on her. He noted with approval that her breasts were not too large. It fit her body perfectly. Thank God she doesn't have implants, I thought. I hate them. After we got dressed, she led me into the kitchen where her roommates were having breakfast. I felt a little awkward. There was no way they hadn't heard us, but Susan calmly introduced me to Missy and Brianna, who clearly weren't surprised to see me. Susan explained that the three of them had been best friends at Vassar and had teamed up again to live together after graduation. We were called the Three Musketeers in Poughkeepsie, she said proudly. After breakfast, it was time for me to leave. Susan came down with me in the elevator and stayed with me on the sidewalk until the receptionist called a taxi. She kissed me goodbye, then looked deeply into my eyes. Last night was wonderful, all of it. Call me. I had no problem promising to do this. As I got into the taxi, she leaned over and said, "Surprise me again." She then turned to go back inside, and the taxi driver drove off into traffic. This is how our romance began. The intervals between our meetings quickly shortened until my trips to Mountain View and her trips to Boston became the only breaks. The extent to which we shared interests and tastes was truly remarkable. I was thinking about writing a review for Contact. If there was any negative in our relationship, it was the self-imposed stress I felt from having to find new experiences to surprise Susan. She loved them and always looked forward to the next ones. I tried to diversify them. One day, I took her to Fort Tryon Park on the Hudson to see the monasteries. All New Yorkers have gone to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but surprisingly few visit the cloisters, a branch of the Met. She loved the works of art on display and even more loved walking through the gardens and colonnaded alleys. She thought it was a magical place. Another time, I surprised her by taking her on a Circle Line cruise around Manhattan. She had never done this either and took great pleasure in playing tourist. I think we may have been the only passengers on board that day who spoke English. Beth helped me get tickets to an avant-garde dance performance. The music was really weird, and I had no idea what the dance was supposed to mean, but Susan loved it, and I got big points for taking her. As time passed, I found myself spending more and more time in Susan's apartment. Essentially, we lived together. Her roommates were so used to seeing me that they practically ignored me. However, sometimes I caught them making snide remarks when they thought I wasn't around. Of course, I also took Susan to my place in Brooklyn, but she was clearly uncomfortable there. I could understand this. Her house was much nicer and had more amenities. But I also felt that he and Beth didn't seem to get along. There was never any animosity, but the two never seemed to warm to each other. One Friday, we rented a car and drove to the Hamptons to spend the weekend with her parents. As we pulled onto the Long Island Expressway, I began to feel more and more nervous. I realized that Susan's parents were quite wealthy, and I wondered what they would think of me. My anxiety was not relieved when Susan advised me to turn into the paved driveway that led to the oval turn in front of what could only be described as a mansion. I was fully confident that I would see Jay Gatsby walking out the door. "Mommy, Daddy, we're here," Susan shouted as I dragged our bags into the hallway. Mr. and Mrs. Devereaux came out of the back room in her voice and lovingly greeted their daughter before shaking my hand. Mrs. Please call me Elaine Devereaux was a tall, attractive woman, although she had clearly gained a few pounds and had a couple of plastic surgeries. She easily took my hands and blew kisses to me. I tried not to touch her face. Walter Devereaux was stocky, but he looked as if he had been that way all his life. His hair, thinning and combed back, had turned gray, giving him a noble appearance. Even though he was approaching 60, his handshake was strong. The drive was long, and since we stopped for lunch along the way, it was already quite late by the time we arrived. Accordingly, after a short conversation, we were shown upstairs to our bedrooms. Susan went to her old room. I was shown to the guest bedroom. Mrs. Devereaux informed us that breakfast would be served at 8 o'clock in the solarium. Then they wished us good night. Susan giggled and waved, then disappeared into her room. I got ready for bed, wondering what the next day would bring. Before I could turn off the light, the bedroom door swung open and Susan slipped inside. She was wearing a nightgown like a young girl, but she still managed to look incredibly sexy. She pulled back the blanket and slid next to me. "Should we do this?" I asked with concern. "What if your parents?" She pressed her fingers to my lips to silence me. She whispered, "Forget about Mom and Dad. I do what I want to do." After that, there were no words. When I woke up the next morning, I was alone in bed. I checked the time and found it was already 7:30, so I quickly got up, showered, and shaved, keeping Mrs. Devereaux's breakfast schedule in mind. At 5 minutes past 8, I reached the solarium, a large glass-walled room overlooking the pool. "It's good of you to join us," said Mr. Devereaux, and I wasn't sure whether he was welcoming me or reproaching me for my tardiness. Over a breakfast that I thought could easily serve twice as many people, Walter laid out his plans for the day. "I thought we could enjoy a light lunch by the pool today. Then we can drive around the neighborhood in the car and show Susan how much has changed. We'll have dinner at the club tonight." I was disappointed. Of course, I had nothing else to do, but I was hoping that I could spend some time with just Susan. However, this weekend it turned out that was not the case. After a leisurely breakfast, Walter and Elaine gave us a tour of the house and grounds. When we arrived last night, I could tell the place was huge, but as I walked through the long hallways and huge rooms, I was amazed. Their dining room alone was larger than my entire apartment in Brooklyn. If they walk around this place regularly, I thought, how can they possibly gain weight? After the tour, we all went back to our rooms to change clothes. I put on some old shorts and a t-shirt and then walked barefoot through the lush grass to the pool. This time only Walter defeated me. He was shirtless and his belly hung over the top of his bathing suit. He sat down under a booth in the shade, and at his hand was a large jug of screwdrivers, as I learned. Then the ladies made their grand entrance. Elaine in a one-piece suit designed to hide her excess weight, Susan in a bikini that could wake the dead. I was a little amazed that she had chosen such a daring outfit for her parents, but they just smiled indulgently at their daughter and made themselves comfortable. It soon became clear that the pool and solarium were intended for women. While they lay there in the sun, Walter and I stayed under the booth with screwdrivers for drinking. He had already finished his second, and I was halfway through my first. As we sat there, he began to outline the current political situation. I was a guest, and I thought I was a pretty smart guy, so I kept my mouth shut and just listened. Politically, I considered myself a moderate, maybe a little right-wing for that matter. Listening to Walter, I realized that he was somewhere to the right of Genghis Khan. He spoke in detail about what is wrong with the country and what needs to be done to fix it. I just sat quietly while he reasoned, occasionally biting my tongue in response to some of his more outrageous statements. At one point, I had a mental picture of me introducing him to Mickey and Beth, and I had a hard time not laughing at the unlikely scene. Between the warm sun and more alcohol than I usually drank, I felt quite sleepy. Apparently, I was not alone, because after snacking on the canapes we had brought, we all retired indoors for an afternoon nap. I had planned to nap for just a few minutes, but was shocked when I woke up to find it was already the middle of the day. Once I was dressed and downstairs, Walter, looking no worse for all the screwdrivers he'd used up, put us in his Jaguar XJ and started giving us a tour of the area. Most of the conversation was directed at Susan, with Mom and Dad eager to point out everything that had changed since she moved to Manhattan. As for me, it was enough for me to stare at the mansions overlooking the Atlantic shore. It is clear that there was serious money here. By the time we got back to the DeVero house, it was almost time for dinner. I was informed that the dress code was casual, but I had already guessed that casual here meant something different than what I would wear in Brooklyn. Accordingly, I put on nice trousers and a knit shirt, over which I put on a sports jacket. I felt comfortable until I walked down the hallway and saw Elaine and Susan wearing cocktail dresses that I thought would be at home at the Academy Awards. I was about to panic at the thought of embarrassing Susan and myself when Walter showed up. In any case, his clothes were but more casual than mine. He didn't even bother to put on socks. I was extremely relieved, and when we arrived at the club, it quickly became apparent that this dichotomy was the norm. All the women dressed to impress each other, and the men wore the most casual clothes that their wives allowed them to carry with them. However, I noticed that the logos that appeared on men's clothing belonged exclusively to expensive brands. Dinner was excellent, not much conversation. Susan's mother was essentially conducting a monologue filled with gossip about people and families I didn't know. Walter's conversation was limited to pointing out various men at other tables and telling stories of how they made their fortune. There were a few names that I recognized from reading Wall Street magazine, but after a while I found it difficult to pay attention to his list of luxuries. My only relief came when Susan looked away from her mother for a moment and winked at me. When we got home, Walter insisted that I go with him to the library for an afternoon brandy. As we sat in large leather wingback chairs, he began asking me about my background and upbringing. "So you're from Tennessee," he said. "Did you grow up on a farm?" I had to smile. "Well, my great-great-grandfather had a farm, but we've been city people since then." "Oh," he said, "then what did your father do?" "He was a lawyer," I told him. Of course, Music City." He probably did a lot of copyright work, music, lyrics, recording contracts, things like that, Walter mused out loud. I loved my father and was proud of him and his accomplishments. Actually, no, I said firmly. Most of his work was in constitutional law. He even argued several cases before the Supreme Court. Tennessee Supreme Court, he asked. No, I said, different. After that, the conversation seemed to die down. I don't know if Walter didn't believe me or if I didn't care. The next afternoon, I was relieved when Susan and I were finally able to get into our rental car and head back to Manhattan. It was like I was on trial all the time, and I felt like I had lost the case. As I drove, I was remembering the events of the weekend when Susan started laughing. You should see your face now. You look like you just got back from a trip to the dentist. Even though I had to smile at that, I wasn't ready to forgive and forget just yet. Well, you would look the same if you worked out all weekend. Are they always like this? She smiled at me. Don't let them get to you. They're just a little overprotective. You have to remember that I am their only child. I looked at her curiously. We never discussed her childhood. What was it like growing up in this house? It was actually quite funny. I've had them around my finger since I can remember. They had all these plans for me, piano lessons, ballet, exclusive schools for girls, and all that. But I didn't like all this, and I just did what I wanted. They always gave in and basically let me get away with murder. They got that for me, she said with a laugh. I remember they wanted me to go to some stupid boarding school for young ladies. But I didn't want any part of it, so the first week I ran away and stayed with some college guy I met at a party. They were frantic with worry, and when I finally returned home, they promised to never try to force me to do anything I didn't want to do. Then her face took on a more serious expression. I was acting pretty wild for a while, but in my second year, one of my best friends lost her father in a plane crash. Suddenly, all their money disappeared, and she and her mother had to move in with relatives. I realized that if anything happened to me, I wouldn't be able to take care of myself. So I started taking my studies seriously and getting good grades, and that's how I ended up at Vassar, and that's why I'm here now. Then she suddenly gave me a mischievous smile. But I haven't changed completely. I still do what I want when I want. I was interested in learning a little more about Susan's background. I thought her story explained some of her character traits, but I was still worried about the exam I had to take this weekend, so I brought the conversation back to this issue. I guess I didn't make a very good impression on your parents this weekend. Oh, she said dismissively, don't take it to heart. They don't think anyone is good enough for me. Then she smiled slyly. But Dad warned me to enter into a marriage contract with you. I sat there trying to comprehend her last words. On the one hand, I was angry that I was considered a fortune hunter who was only interested in family money. Hell, I didn't even know how rich they were until this weekend. But suddenly I realized that Susan and I hadn't even talked about marriage. Did Susan say something to her father? Could she be hinting that she welcomes the proposal? Suddenly my heart started beating faster. I knew I was head over heels in love with her, but I wasn't sure if she felt the same about me. Maybe this is an indication of her true feelings. I extended my hand through the center console, and we held hands all the way to Manhattan. Unfortunately, I had no real opportunity to discuss Susan's feelings about the marriage since I had to travel west again when I returned to work. And as soon as I returned, she went to Boston for a few days. The only positive thing about our travel schedules was that the day after one of us returned was celebrated with sex. While she was away on one of her business trips, I decided to propose to her. One lunchtime, I went to the bank and opened my safe deposit box. Inside the velvet box were my grandmother's engagement and wedding rings. She entrusted them to my mother to give them to me for my bride. Of course, my mother never had time to do this, but after the death of my parents, the rings passed to me. I didn't know how much they were worth in today's jewelry market, but their sentimental value in antique settings was much more important to me, and I hoped Susan would feel the same. Susan's flight from Boston didn't arrive until late Tuesday night, and she was so tired that all she wanted to do was go to bed. But before she did, I made her promise to go with me on Wednesday night. "Do you have another surprise for me, baby?" she asked. "You'll just have to wait and see," I replied calmly, even though my heart was racing. The next evening, I met her at the office, and we took a taxi to one of her favorite restaurants for dinner. Then we went dancing at a club that we frequented. We had a good time, but I noticed that Susan was a little disappointed. Finally, when I thought it was the right time, I grabbed her and dragged her towards the exit. I hailed another taxi and told the driver to take us to Fifth Avenue between 33rd and 34th Streets. As we drove, Susan asked me where we were going, but I just brushed her off. The taxi stopped at the curb, and here we were at the Empire State Building. Again, I ignored Susan's questions and led her to the elevators, where I took out the 2 express passes I had purchased earlier. We silently ascended to the 102nd floor. Susan clearly expected an explanation, but I said nothing. We walked out to the observation deck, and I pointed her to the fenced edge of the building. She looked out at the sea of lights that engulfed lower Manhattan, and then turned to me. "Well, why did you want to?" Then she fell silent and gasped when she saw me on one knee, holding an open jewelry box. "Susan Devereaux, this is my grandmother's engagement ring. Will you make me the happiest person in the world tonight by accepting it and becoming my wife?" She froze in shock, but tourists and other visitors noticed us, and they quickly began chanting, "Say yes, say yes." She looked around, then looked back at me. Suddenly, her eyes sparkled with excitement, and she said, "Let's do it. Yes, let's do it." The crowd cheered, and after I put the ring on her finger, she put her arms around my neck and kissed me. After that, we had to go back to her apartment so she could tell her roommates. Even though it was well after midnight, she woke up the other 2 Musketeers to show me the ring and tell me about my proposal. All 3 exchanged enthusiastic hugs and quiet remarks, stealing glances at me. I was a little unsure, but then Missy and Brianna ran up to hug me and congratulate me too. When all this fuss died down, Susan retreated to her bedroom. She hugged me tightly and whispered in my ear, "Oh, Peter, that was the best surprise. Such a cliché, I never would have guessed." "I'm so glad you're happy, honey," I told her. "Tomorrow we can start discussing wedding plans and—" "No," Susan said emphatically, "I don't want to wait. No big wedding in the Hamptons, no engraved invitations, no parties. Tomorrow, let's go to the registry office tomorrow and get married tomorrow." "But your parents," I objected. "No," she repeated, "I want to do it now. It'll be great, Peter. Engaged tonight and married tomorrow. It's just perfect. Don't worry about my parents. They'll get over it." And that's how we found ourselves at the Manhattan Marriage Bureau at noon on Thursday. Of course, we learned that getting married in New York required waiting in lines and a lot of paperwork, although they now had computerized kiosks to make it easier. After filling out all the forms and paying $35, we learned about the mandatory 24-hour waiting period. But this did not dampen Susan's enthusiasm. "That's even better," she said. "We can get married tomorrow afternoon and Missy and Brianna can come and be my bridesmaids." Now she had something like a wild passion, and it was impossible to stop her. In fact, it didn't bother me. I would be happy to participate in any ceremony that would make Susan happy, but if she was willing to forego a formal wedding, so much the better. I didn't have any immediate family that would be upset that they couldn't come to my wedding, and I knew my friends would be just as excited to read about it on Facebook. But I made a special effort to call Mickey and Beth, and they both promised to come. So on Friday afternoon, after taking half a day off from work, I arrived at the Marriage Bureau, dressed in my best suit and tie, with Mickey and Beth serving as witnesses. We arrived a few minutes early, so I had the pleasure of seeing Susan show up. It was obvious that she didn't stick to tradition. Instead of white, she wore a black dress that was sexy and elegant, and she had a large hat that covered one eye. Brianna and Missy stood on either side, each wearing matching ivory dresses. How they managed to coordinate their outfits, I will never know, but to me and probably many other viewers, They looked like they could have starred in a music video just as easily as they could have starred in a wedding. The ceremony itself was very short. After all, officials had a schedule. After we solemnly swore fidelity, I kissed my new wife, and the deed was done. I heard a loud pop and saw Beth holding the bottle of champagne she had brought. I was surprised to see tears in her eyes, but I think all women cry at weddings. We had to leave to make room for the next couple, so we went out into the hallway. No one thought to bring champagne glasses, so we all drank from the bottle in celebration. As the excitement began to die down, Mickey showed up with the keys to a car, which he took for me. We all went outside to Worth Street where the car was illegally parked, and I helped my new wife into it. As we pulled away from the curb, Susan casually tossed a bouquet of flowers out the window, and it landed right into the arms of a surprised Beth. I guess that's one old superstition that won't come true, I laughed. As I headed west toward the Holland Tunnel, Susan turned to me. "Where are we going?" she demanded. "Be patient," I told her. "This is another surprise." I already made her pack for a short honeymoon, but I didn't tell her where we were going. I was determined to surprise her again since she loved surprises so much. We headed north on I-81 and drove all the way to Syracuse before turning west on I-90. It wasn't until we got to Buffalo that Susan realized where we were going. "Oh my God," she said, bursting into laughter. "We're going to honeymoon in Niagara Falls." She guessed right. I figured the only way to beat the cliché of proposing on top of the Empire State Building was to honeymoon in the self-proclaimed honeymoon capital of the world. Susan loved the idea. She couldn't wait to tell Missy and Brianna where we went. But she was even more delighted when she found out where we were staying. I searched the internet for the perfect place and was confident I had found it. When we pulled up under a neon heart-shaped sign that said, "Lover's Rest," she laughed out loud. And when the oily receptionist opened the door to our room, she could hardly contain her laughter. It was a honeymoon suite with an in-room jacuzzi and a huge heart-shaped bed covered in pink satin sheets. Later, when she took off all but her French panties and jumped on me in that kitschy bed, she burst into laughter again when I flicked a switch on the wall and the bed began to spin and vibrate. "This is perfect," she cried. "Absolutely perfect." Even though we only had a long weekend, we had a wonderful honeymoon. We even climbed out of that ridiculous bed to see Niagara and Horseshoe Falls, even getting wet from the spray on the Maid of the Mist boat. Although Niagara Falls feels cheap and overly commercialized, the surrounding area towards Lake Ontario is quite beautiful, and we enjoyed driving around. Manhattan. We were tired but happy heading back to Manhattan. When we returned to the apartment, we left our bags unpacked and fell into bed. After a long weekend of honeymoon sex, sleep was the only thing on our minds. "Good night, Mrs. Morrison," I whispered, holding her head against my arm. "Thank you, baby." "What a wonderful surprise," she muttered as she drifted off to sleep. By the time we woke up the next morning, Missy and Brianna had already left for work. I deliberately took another day off, not only to rest, but also to transport my belongings and clothes. When I brought the first batch into the apartment, it seemed like a good time to raise a potentially sensitive issue with Susan. "When are Missy and Brianna going to move?" I asked. "Why would they do this?" she asked in surprise. "Well," I began stammering, "you know, now that we're married, I just assumed that they—" "Oh no," she said, "I couldn't ask them to leave. Where would they go?" I didn't have a ready answer for this. "But won't they feel uncomfortable living here with us?" I asked, trying to find a convincing argument. "No," she said dismissively. "You and I have been living together for months now, and it hasn't been a problem. Besides, the three of us have been together since college. We can't stop now." I was not very pleased with her answer, but decided to remain silent. It was clear that while Susan loved excitement and surprise, she was not particularly fond of change. I thought my best hope was that in time she would change her mind. Either that, or we'll eventually move, and the problem will resolve itself. The idea of living with two seductive women in addition to my wife in an apartment in New York City may seem like a teenager's dream, but the reality was very different. Basically, they acted as if I wasn't there. I don't mean that they were rude or hostile, they just went about their business as if nothing had changed. It wasn't unusual to see them in their underwear in the apartment, and although I enjoyed the spectacle, they showed no signs of seductive intentions. It was more like I was a new piece of furniture that they quickly got used to. We had friendly conversations over food. The rest of the time I was mostly ignored, except for the occasional whispers and giggles among the three of them. I noticed that this often happened in the morning after Susan and I made love. I expected there would be consequences from her parents when they found out what we had done, but Susan wasn't worried. I listened to her call them in the evening when we returned. "Mommy, guess what I did last weekend?" she said indifferently. It was clear from the part of the conversation that I could hear that Mommy and Daddy were unhappy, but Susan was not afraid. Half an hour later, she hung up, saying, "I love you too, Mommy." "Well," I asked, "how did they take it?" "They were upset," she admitted, "but they'll get over it. They can never stay angry with me for long." As the weeks and months passed, Susan and I quickly adjusted to our new life together. In truth, the new routine was not much different from the old, only our family situation had changed. I continued to fly frequently to the West Coast, but now my job has changed. I was promoted to network security team leader and felt pretty confident in my career. I tried to keep in touch with Mickey and Beth, although of course I didn't see them as often as before. At least I was able to help them when I moved. One of my work colleagues needed an apartment, and I directed him to my old one. He moved in a week after I moved in, so Mickey and Beth weren't hurt financially by my sudden departure. If there was any stress in my life, it was due to my desire to keep my wife happy and entertained. As you can imagine, it's not easy to constantly come up with new and unexpected surprises. Our busy work and travel schedules didn't help, and the intervals between surprises inevitably grew longer. Nevertheless, when I managed to organize a surprise, Susan felt almost physical pleasure from it. Her little surprises clearly suited her impulsive nature, and the pleasure she got from them encouraged me to keep trying. Our first anniversary was approaching, and I definitely wanted to do something special and unique to celebrate the occasion, but coming up with something appropriate was difficult. I was returning from the West Coast on an overnight flight, and since I can't sleep on planes, I used the time to think about what I could do to really wow Susan. The fact that she would be expecting something special made the task even more difficult. My flight was delayed due to a severe thunderstorm system moving through the Central US, so I did not arrive at JFK until the next morning. I was completely exhausted, so I called the office and told them I was taking the day off. When I returned to the apartment, it was empty. All three girls had already left for work. I threw my bags on the floor and fell on the bed. But despite my tiredness, my internal clock kept me awake, so I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling and continuing to think about how I could surprise Susan. Suddenly, I had an idea. Wanting to check on her, I started to take my laptop out of my bag when I noticed that Susan had left her personal computer on. She usually carefully turns it off after use, but apparently this morning she was checking something before leaving for work and forgot to do it. I moved the mouse and the screensaver disappeared, revealing the Google News window. This is my devoted wife, I thought. I switched to Google Search, but the searches didn't turn up anything useful. Without thinking, I clicked the Close command. Suddenly another window appeared in front of me, the one Susan had left open. I was amazed to see a familiar logo at the top of the screen, Contact. Why was Susan visiting the Contact page, I wondered. Under the Contact banner, there was a window that said, "Thank you for renewing your annual Contact membership. We look forward to connecting you with exciting new people who match your interests and desires." I sat stunned. This cannot mean what I think it means. Is she really still looking for other men? I quickly opened the basket to see what I could find. It was empty. Susan had cleaned it recently, perhaps even this morning. I went back to the browser and clicked Show All Downloads. As expected, the screen was clear. If there were any downloads in there, she obviously moved them to the trash and then emptied it. But I knew the Google Chrome browser well, and knew that clicking Clear All did not delete downloads. So I opened the Windows Downloads folder and gasped. It was filled with profiles from Contact. She downloaded dozens of them. I have arranged them in chronological order. A quick glance showed that a new profile appeared approximately every 2 weeks. I switched to File Name View, and the profiles are sorted alphabetically. Of course, there was Morrison in the M section. I clicked on it and saw a photo Beth took almost a year ago. I switched back to chronological order. The earliest profiles were from before we met. To my horror, the last one was dated yesterday. I opened it and a handsome red-haired stranger stared at me. I was about to close it when I noticed that this contact lived in Boston, not New York. Susan was supposed to fly to Boston tomorrow. Part of me called for calm. There must be some innocent explanation, some reason why this doesn't mean what I feared, that my beautiful wife was seeing other men. For a moment, I thought I was going to throw up. My stomach was twisting and turning, and if I really needed to throw up, I wouldn't be able to walk to the bathroom because I had no strength in my legs. Gradually, however, a calmness came over me and my stomach settled down. I was able to think again and began to consider what to do next. Deep down, I knew the answer, but when I confronted Susan, I would need hard evidence. The first thing I did was take a flash drive from my briefcase and copy all the profiles from Susan's downloads folder, then transfer them to my laptop. Next, I returned Susan's computer to the same condition. It was in when I returned home. Then I turned on my own computer and used it to search for detective agencies. Finally, I put the apartment in order so that there would be no sign of my presence. On the sidewalk, I called the detective agency I found. Yes, they told me, one of their operatives would be happy to meet with me. When I got to the agency, I was a little disappointed. I half expected a place that was a little smelly and filled with smoke, with detectives with names like Spade and Archer. Instead, the waiting room I walked into could have been the office of a law firm, and the detective who came out to me was a well-dressed woman. Despite her corporate appearance, Miss Martin's calm, professional manner put me at ease, and I began to tell her the whole story. She took copious notes, and when I mentioned the last profile, she took the flash drive and copied the files to her computer. She also copied Susan's profile, which was still on my laptop. Finally, she looked up from her notes. "So, Mr. Morrison, what exactly do you want us to find out for you?" "I've already decided. Right now, I just need to know what Susan will be doing in Boston tomorrow night. If my suspicions are correct, that will be enough. If not, then we'll think further." She nodded. "Very well, we should provide you with a full report of her activities tomorrow afternoon." Leaving the agency's office, I was impressed by their professionalism. I also liked that Miss Martin didn't draw any conclusions or try to calm my fears. Her approach was purely businesslike. The facts will speak for themselves. I called Susan from the building lobby and was glad it went to her voicemail. "Hey, honey, just wanted to let you know I'm stuck in Mountain View for a couple more days. Hope you have a safe trip to Boston. See you Friday afternoon. Love you." This last lie was difficult for me. Then I made another call. "Mickey, can I come see you?" I don't know what was on my face, but when Mickey and Beth saw me, they invited me onto the couch and Beth gave me a comforting hug. Then it all came out. What I found, what I was afraid of, and what I did about it. Mickey was horrified and in disbelief, but Beth just shook her head. I knew she never really liked Susan, and I guess in retrospect, she was right. We discussed the possibilities and made plans until they had to go to work. Everything, of course, depended on what the detective agency found. But although Mickey still hoped for the best, Beth had no doubts, and unfortunately, neither did I. Turns out their other roommate was out of town, so I snuggled up on his bed for the night. The next day I got up and went to work as usual. It felt strange to follow the old route and ride the same subways after such a long time. I received a call from Miss Martin from the detective agency early in the afternoon. She told me I could pick up their report that afternoon if I wanted. I said I'd be there at 3 o'clock sharp. As I rode the elevator that afternoon, I felt waves of conflicting emotions. At one point, I felt like a patient going into surgery. The next moment, I felt wings of hope on my face, urging me to believe that this was all some stupid misunderstanding on my part. I had to find out which of this was true very soon. As soon as I sat down in Miss Martin's office, she pulled out a printed report from her desk, bound with one of those homemade covers. "Mr. Morrison," she said without preamble, "I'm sorry to tell you that your suspicions about your wife have been correct. Our Boston operative has been following your wife from the moment she rode down the hotel elevator yesterday morning throughout her workday, and until she returns to the hotel after finishing work." I opened the report and saw a photo of Susan in the hotel lobby. She was wearing one of her business suits. The timestamp on the photo was 6:30 p.m. The detective continued talking. She then went up to her room, apparently to freshen up and change clothes. About an hour later, she returned to the lobby, where she was met by her companion for the evening. I turned the page and saw Susan coming out of the elevator wearing a deep V-neck dress. Lots of cleavage for a business dinner, I thought ruefully. When I turned to the next page, I saw her dinner date. It was the same red-haired man I saw on Contact's profile. He kissed her on the cheek in a friendly greeting. The officer followed them to a restaurant where they had a few drinks and dinner. Miss Martin continued. Afterwards, they went to a nightclub where they drank more and danced for several hours. The photo on the next page was dark. It was clearly taken in low light. However, it was clear that it was Susan and Red, and they were caught in the middle of a kiss. After that, Miss Martin said calmly, they caught a taxi and returned to the hotel, where they went up to Susan's room. The photo showed part of the elevator interior. Even though the door was in the process of closing, you could still see enough of the couple inside to recognize them. They were in an embrace. The timestamp was 23:45. The next morning, the detective said, your wife's boyfriend went down the elevator alone and hailed a taxi around 7:30, and Mrs. Morrison came down about an hour later. She left the hotel and took a taxi back to the office where she worked. The last photo was of Susan dressed in a smart business suit as she got into a taxi with the help of a hotel doorman. I looked at the detective. So you have no real evidence of what happened in the room that night? I asked. She looked at me calmly. We are very thorough, Mr. Morrison. For the considerable thanks you will find on your bill, we were able to gain access to Mrs. Morrison's room while she was at work yesterday. We installed a motion-activated spy camera in the room. After Mrs. Morrison left this morning, we were able to pick her up. You will find a CD of the evening's events at the end of your folder. I turned the folder over and started to take the disc out of my pocket when Miss Martin reached out and stopped me. Mr. Morrison, we strongly advise our clients not to watch such videos. You already know what happened in the room. The video will not add to your knowledge. What it will do is create emotionally charged images that you will not be able to forget. Please believe me. In this case, a little knowledge is better than a lot. I removed my hand. I still had to decide whether to watch the video, but I felt the truth of her words. How much pain am I willing to endure? We sat in silence for a minute, then she spoke again. Mr. Morrison, after receiving confirmation of a spouse's infidelity, a surprisingly large percentage of our clients consider reconciliation. Do you think you could go for it? I didn't have to think long about the answer. No way. First of all, we've been married for less than a year, and she's already sleeping with other people. How can I forgive that? Secondly, it wasn't a casual affair. She chose this guy and got involved with him. And the worst part is, I know he's not the only one. There were 37 profiles on her computer, and I'm sure she slept with every one of them. Miss Martin was not embarrassed by my outburst. I understand, Mr. Morrison. If I were you, I would feel the same way, but I had to ask. She paused. Now let me ask another question. Do you have legal representation? No, I shook my head. I don't think I've gotten to that point yet. The truth is that I didn't know a single lawyer. In that case, I will be happy to recommend to you a lawyer who we have worked with many times in the past. He is honest and reasonable. He also has the advantage of being in the same building. I assumed that the detective agency received some kind of commission for each client that was referred to a lawyer, but frankly, I didn't care. I had a mission and I had to hurry. "Can you arrange a meeting with him today?" I asked. I returned to Brooklyn in the evening with a personalized folder packed in an envelope, along with my new lawyer's business card. When I got to the apartment, Mickey had already left, but Beth was free for the night, so she got all the details. When it came to the disc, I was still hesitant to watch it. Beth surprised me by offering to review it herself and then advise me. She went into her room with him, closing the door. I washed my face and changed into jeans and a t-shirt when she reappeared. She had tears in her eyes. She hugged me and quietly said, "Don't watch it. I see how hurt you are now. It will only make the situation worse." I decided to follow her advice. There was no doubt about what I was going to do. Now my only concern was focusing on the details and getting it right. I didn't want any distractions. When Mickey returned, the three of us talked about my plan again. I needed to rely on them for organization and attention to detail, but they were already discussing it as if it was their plan and I was just following them. They seemed to take what happened to me very personally, and it really touched me. Friday afternoon, I returned to Susan's apartment with bags in my hands, as if I had just returned from the airport. When I opened the door and walked in, three Miss Kettier girls were sitting on the couch, whispering and giggling. As soon as I walked in, Susan jumped up, ran towards me, and jumped into my arms while Missy and Brianna giggled. "Oh, baby, I missed you so much," Susan exclaimed, kissing me. Then she stepped back and looked at me slyly. "You know this weekend is our anniversary, right?" she asked. "How could I forget?" I answered calmly. "And before you ask, yes, I have a surprise for you. But you'll just have to wait until Sunday to get it." Susan was so excited that she began to tremble. "Oh, I can't wait that long. Come on, kid, at least give me a little hint. What do you have planned?" "No," I said firmly. "My lips are sealed. You just have to wait." The rest of the evening went normally, except that Susan continued to whisper to Missy and Brianna while we relaxed in front of the TV. I assumed they were either discussing what Sunday would bring or comparing Red and me. Either way, I ignored them. When it was time to go to bed, Susan wanted sex, as she usually did when one of us returned from a trip. But given what I learned about her activities in Boston, I decided that I would never touch her again. So when she started pestering me, I firmly pushed her away. "No, baby, not today. And not tomorrow night either. It's all part of the surprise. You just have to stay chaste until Sunday." I think she was shocked by this turn of events, and I knew she was disappointed because she was always really hungry for sex when I came back from California. But the desire for her big surprise weighed on her equally, and she finally lay down and fell into a restless sleep. Saturday was an equally frustrating day for her. I think she tasked Missy and Brianna with getting something out of me, because when Susan wasn't around, one or the other of them kept offering to help organize the surprise. But I calmly told them that everything was under control and no help was needed. I reverently hoped that this was true. I then piqued their interest even more by letting them know that they would be part of the surprise. This caused them even more excitement, and when Susan returned, they couldn't wait to tell her about this new development. She, in turn, could not sit still, acting like a little girl on the eve of Christmas. That night, I gave them no hints and no satisfaction. Instead of going out, I suggested ordering takeout, and not wanting to leave me alone without making any preparations, they reluctantly stayed with me. When it was time to go to bed, I felt that Susan's internal conflict had reached a critical point. She was still looking forward to her surprise, but she was also becoming more and more excited. She did everything to seduce me, but I remained firm. "Come on, Susan, you don't want to ruin the surprise." This stopped her, and she turned away with resentment and fell asleep. The next morning, I knew I needed to reveal something, or I would face a riot. So at breakfast, I gave them some instructions. I said that we needed to leave the apartment at exactly 12:30. No special clothing was required, no bags needed to be packed, and we would all leave in the same taxi. Having revealed these preliminary details, I left them in a state of excitement and speculation until I went downstairs to make a quick call to Mickey. He assured me that everything was ready. "Just be there on time and relax, enjoy the show," he told me. At 12:30, I collected the three girls and took them downstairs. The butler found us a taxi, and I tipped him $50. He was surprised, but I liked the guy and figured I'd probably never see him again. Three girls climbed into the back seat of the taxi, and I sat in front with the driver. This allowed me to lean over and tell him where we were going without the three Kettier misses being able to hear. This caused an uproar which I ignored with a smile. Even taking into account the traffic, we arrived at the place a few minutes early. The girls got out of the taxi in some confusion, looking up at the imposing figure of Christopher Columbus. "Why are we in Columbus Circle?" Brianna asked. "Is there a surprise going on here?" With a smile on my face, I led them to the base of the statue and asked them to sit on the wide steps on one side. Columbus Circle was full of tourists and passers-by, some taking photos, others strolling around enjoying the sunny weather. At that moment, a man walked up and placed a large object on the ledge behind the girls. I recognized it. It was an old-fashioned boombox. He turned it on. Suddenly, a rhythmic drumbeat began to sound from the speakers, surprising the girls and attracting the attention of many people in the circle and beyond. As the beat continued, several passers-by began to gather in a circle that spanned the entire monument. I didn't hear the signal, but they suddenly started dancing as one, performing a modified version of the famous Rockettes routine from Radio City Music Hall. The drum line then transitioned into the hit song, "The One That Got Away." I saw Susan clap in delight. Katy Perry was one of her favorite pop artists, and it was her current top 10 hit. As the dancers pirouetted, floated, and kicked in front of Susan, Missy, and Brianna, Katie's sweet voice sang the chorus. "In another life, I would be your girl. We'd keep all our promises. Be us against the world." Tourists applauded and cheered as they watched this seemingly spontaneous performance. The three girls sat smiling and laughing. I knew Susan loved it. She always liked to be the center of attention. As the dancers continued to circle around the statue, one of them appeared from the side, carrying a poster with a photo of a man, which he showed first to the crowd and then to the girls. "Is this the one who left?" the crowd wondered. Then another dancer appeared with a poster of another man's face, followed by another and another. Susan laughed wildly as she watched the show, but Missy suddenly frowned and leaned over to shout something in Brianna's ear, pointing at the photos that flashed before them. She seemed to recognize one of the gentlemen with whom Susan had fun. In fact, all the faces the dancers wore were profiles of men from Contact. The next poster caused even more concern among Susan's friends. Brianna began tugging and yelling at Susan, trying to get her to take a closer look at that last photo. Suddenly, Susan's head shot up as she realized what Brianna was saying. She began to spin around, trying to get a better look at all the photographs the dancers were carrying. Her anxiety increased significantly when she saw the last one. It was the red-haired man with whom she had spent the night in Boston last week. As the song transitioned into the bridge, the line of dancers continued to dance and do high kicks, each holding their banners high for everyone to see. "All this money can't buy me a time machine. Can't replace you with 1,000,000 rings. I should have told you what you meant to me, 'cause now I pay the price." At that moment, all the dancers threw their banners to the ground. Then Mickey and Beth appeared from behind the statue, sharing a banner with photos of Susan and me. As they walked right in front of the three seated girls, their faces pale even in the bright daylight, Katy Perry's voice filled with the chorus again. "In another life, I would make you stay, so I don't have to say, you were the one that got away. The one that got away." As the chorus repeated, Mickey and Beth pulled on the sides of the poster, and it suddenly split in two, separating my photo from Susan's. Then they threw both halves to the ground. The crowd was confused. The dancers stopped and the performance seemed to end, but the boombox was still playing the last line of the chorus in what seemed like an endless loop. and instead of the laughter they expected to see from the three girls who were clearly the center of attention, they cried and hugged each other in obvious frustration. A few people started to applaud, but were silenced by others who wanted to see what would happen next. As the last line of the song continued to repeat, the circle of dancers opened, and I walked forward at a brisk pace. I walked straight towards Susan, and when she raised her head and looked at me, tears were streaming down her face. I handed her a copy of my divorce petition. "Susan Devereaux Morrison, you have been served with notice," I shouted. As I turned to leave, Susan jumped up to try to follow me, but Mickey turned and scowled at her, and his 6'5" frame scared her, so she sat back, sobbing, on the steps while her friends tried to console her. But Beth had the last word. She approached Susan with a determined look on her face. "You bitch," she screamed. "You had a good man, but now, thank God, he's the one who left." The music stopped, the dancers disappeared into the crowd, and the rest of the audience moved in awkward silence. The only sound was the sobs of the three girls sitting at the feet of Christopher Columbus. Mickey led Beth and me to a taxi he was waiting for, and the three of us headed to Brooklyn. I was tempted to go back and ask Susan how she liked her surprise, but I decided that would be unnecessary. Susan repeatedly tried to contact me, but I stubbornly refused to answer her calls, emails, or messages. I waited until her top lawyer contacted mine, and then I laid down my terms. The only time I was willing to talk to Susan was when we would meet to discuss the division of the property. After numerous negotiations, we finally agreed on a date and time for the meeting. The session took place at the offices of Susan's law firm. My lawyer didn't like it, but he was pretty unhappy with me by then. I did not care. We were ushered into a conference room that was the size of Susan's apartment. I think my lawyer was a little scared, but I knew I was in control of the situation, so it didn't bother me. The only thing that surprised me was seeing Walter, the father Susan, sitting next to his daughter. I should have known, I thought. He's probably had to bail her out of trouble more than once. When we all sat down, I looked across the table at them all. Susan's lawyer looked at me like I was some strange insect under a microscope. Walter looked at me angrily. He couldn't bear that I had hurt his precious daughter. As for Susan, she didn't want to look at me at all. Susan's lawyer spoke first. "So, Mr. Morrison, we are all here today at your insistence to discuss the division of property in connection with the dissolution of this marriage. We have a proposal that I think you will find more than fair. Perhaps we will start with it." My lawyer cleared his throat and began to speak, but I interrupted him. "Forget it," I said decisively. Walter Devereaux leaned over to his daughter and tried to whisper in her ear, but I heard him clearly. "I told you to enter into a marriage contract with him." Her lawyer became uncomfortable with this exchange and tried to bring our attention back to the proposed division of property. But again, I didn't want to listen to it. "Leave it," I told him. I turned to Walter. "Mr. Devereaux, I married your daughter for love, not for money. I doubt a man like you can understand this, but my father taught me that a man's honor is much more important than his wealth." Then I turned to Susan's lawyer. "There are two things I want as part of the agreement, and once you agree to them, I will be happy to complete these negotiations without other demands or conditions." I heard Walter quietly mutter, "This is it, this is it." "The first thing I want is for Susan to return my grandmother's engagement ring and wedding ring. They symbolize a commitment to sharing our lives while remaining faithful to each other, and we all now know that Susan did not and never intended to honor such a commitment." I watched as Susan laid her head on the table and began to cry. "The second thing I want is 30 minutes alone with Susan, during which she will agree to answer my questions honestly. Give me those two things, and I will renounce all other claims to this marriage." My lawyer shook his head. He had done his research on the Devereaux estate and probably had a good idea of its value. He was extremely disappointed to learn that he would not be able to receive a percentage of this amount. But Walter Devereaux suddenly perked up. "Will you put it in writing, young man?" he asked enthusiastically. I looked at him coldly. "In my family, A man's word is his bond. But for the sake of your family, I will sign such an agreement." My sarcasm went over him. He was too busy instructing the family lawyer to prepare such an agreement. Then he turned to Susan. "Give it to him," he ordered. "Give him those damn rings, and we'll get out of this trouble." As she continued to cry, he stroked her hand. "Damn it, baby, if you care so much about them, Mommy and we will buy new ones for you." While she was taking off the ancient rings, I stood up. Half an hour had not yet passed, but I heard everything I wanted. When she saw me standing, she also stood up. "Baby, I know I hurt you a lot, but I really love you. You are truly special. I know this is not a traditional marriage, but if you could get over my little need for extra sex, we could be so happy together. This could be really good, baby. I could even get you to meet Missy and Brianna if you wanted." I felt sick, but before I could say anything, her father and lawyer returned to the room, accompanied by my lawyer. Lawyer Devereaux handed me a piece of paper and a pen. "I believe that this agreement fully covers all your requirements, Mr. Morrison, and your lawyer has no objection." I looked at him, and he nodded. I reached across the table, took my grandmother's rings, and put them in my pocket. Then he took the offered pen and signed and dated the document. When I stood up, I saw Walter Devereaux looking at me with curiosity. "It seems I was mistaken about you, young man," he said, and extended his hand. "Perhaps," I replied. "I was undoubtedly mistaken about your daughter, but I believe that my assessment of you is absolutely accurate." With these words, I ignored his hand and left the room. I was lucky that the Google guy who lived with Mickey and Beth was transferred, so I was able to move back in with them. They were great. They both cared very much about my feelings and emotions, and when I felt particularly sad, which happened often, they tried to somehow cheer me up. The day my divorce was finalized, they had a big party at the club where Mickey worked. I was probably the only straight guy at the party, but I still had fun. Despite their efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was a failure. I tried to play the dating game and lost. I tried love and marriage and failed again. Even going back to Mickey and Beth felt like a loss, not because of them, but because I was back where I started. I saw Susan once. I had to attend a meeting in the city center, which lasted until late. When it ended, I was hungry, so I went into a small place where there was a lot of light and noise. I needed more of this in my life, so I walked in and sat down to order my food. I noticed her at the other end of the hall. She was laughing and flirting with a handsome guy, a couple of years younger than me. I lost my appetite and left. She didn't notice me. I had no reason to expect her to change, but the fact that she didn't made me even more sad. So I was probably ready when the recruiter called me a few weeks later. When you work at a hot place like Google, calls from recruiters are pretty common. This guy was looking for someone to lead network security for a large hospital chain. There has been a huge push to digitize medical records so that different departments and specialists can easily share them. Hospitals have now begun to consider network security issues. It sounded interesting enough, but what really caught my attention was that the job was in Nashville. My old hometown has become one of the leading centers of hospital management. I wonder what Walter Devereaux would say about that, I thought ironically. They made me an offer, and I decided to accept it. New York had lost its taste for me, and this offer came at the right time. It was time to move on. When I looked at my bags lying on the floor in the living room of our apartment, I was surprised at how few possessions I had. This is probably the cheapest move this company has ever had, I thought with a grin. The only difficult part of the move was leaving Mickey and Beth. They seemed so strange to me when I first met them. Now they were very dear to me. I reached out to shake Mickey's hand, but he grabbed me in a bear hug that reminded me how big and strong he is. "Don't forget us, Peter," he said seriously. "We won't forget you." I was going to say something witty, but I couldn't. "I won't forget you, I swear," I told him. Then I turned to Beth and saw tears in her eyes again. I couldn't speak for fear that I'd start crying myself, so I leaned over to kiss her on the cheek. To my surprise, she kissed me on the lips. Then she hugged me tightly, turned, and ran to her room. All I had to do was pack my bags and hail a taxi. Nashville felt both foreign and cozy to me. I missed the never-ending excitement of New York City, but loved the southern hospitality of the Nashville people. More importantly, I loved all things green. In New York, all you see is concrete, except for the occasional tree growing out of the sidewalks, but in Nashville there was grass and trees everywhere. I didn't realize how much I missed it. I bought a century-old house in East Nashville, in an old neighborhood where young families were buying and renovating homes. In addition to my bungalow, I now owned a couple of huge old trees and a small lawn that needed mowing. It was right. Once I got settled, I had time to start running again, which was hard to do in New York. I joined a running club, which gave me the opportunity to not only exercise regularly, but also meet people with similar interests. Many of them were women, and so I gradually returned to dating. That's how I ended up outside that club that Saturday night, just to see a woman imitator performing on stage. She looked at me. I don't understand. Why are they doing this? I couldn't help but remember Mickey both Beth, and I remembered how strange and unusual they seemed to me when I first met them. But then the memories of Susan came back to me, and I realized that she was the big mystery to me. I still didn't understand her and doubted that I ever would. I thought back to that night at Grand Central Station and decided that maybe Lady Gaga's answer was as good as any. I turned to my companion and shrugged. Maybe they were born this way. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.